la ecología en relación con el marxismo. Materialismo y naturaleza era el subtítulo, ¿no?, que tenía esta conferencia doble. Ya digo que es un privilegio, a la que es un privilegio asistir. Pensar con Marx hoy pasa inevitablemente por afrontar la crisis socioecológica global, que está estrechamente vinculada al sistema de producción, distribución y consumo capitalista. Y en ese sentido, si la izquierda quisiera pensar con Marx hoy, que era el lema de este congreso, habría de tomarse en serio el alcance y los límites que impone la crisis ecológica y el escenario de declive energético hacia el que vamos. Decía Paco Fernández Buey, uno de nuestros filósofos más queridos, cuando le preguntaron por el dicho gramsciano, decir la verdad es revolucionario, que eso lo que supone es asumir la mayoría de edad del destinatario del mensaje. Y algo todavía más complicado, que hay que decir la verdad, escribía Fernández Buey, incluso cuando ésta disguste o pueda hacer daño en lo inmediato, ¿no?, en los objetivos más inmediatos. Decir la verdad, ese acto revolucionario, supone hoy hablar con franqueza de crisis ecológica y de insostenibilidad. De insostenibilidad en el capitalismo, sí, pero también de las alternativas al capitalismo que continúen por la senda del productivismo, ¿no?, por la dependencia de los combustibles fósiles. Y sin más, os dejo con los dos ponentes. Voy a presentarles a ambos y luego voy a dejar que sean ellos quienes primero intervendrá el profesor Schweickart y después el profesor Otto Wolff. David Schweickart estudió matemáticas en la Universidad de Dayton y se doctoró en matemáticas también en la Universidad de Virginia, para posteriormente ser profesor de esta materia en la Universidad de Kentucky. A partir de su participación en la lucha por los derechos civiles y su implicación en el movimiento contra la guerra de Vietnam, se despertó en él un interés por la filosofía y el marxismo. En concreto, estudió profundamente el Capital y decidió cambiar su carrera docente. Obtuvo el doctorado en filosofía en la Universidad Estatal de Ohio y con una tesis crítica con el capitalismo. Y a partir de ahí, desde mediados de los 70, desde el año 75, lleva dando clases de filosofía en la Universidad Loyola de Chicago. Ha dedicado gran parte o la mayoría de su elaboración teórica a desarrollar una propuesta alternativa al capitalismo que ha llamado democracia económica y sobre la que podéis obtener información sin duda en Internet. En las últimas décadas ha integrado además, y esta es la parte, ¿no?, que hoy nos expondrá, entre sus preocupaciones, también la preocupación por el cambio climático y la lucha contra este, señalando siempre esa conexión muy estrecha entre capitalismo e insostenibilidad o crisis ecológica. Y por su parte, el profesor Otto Wolff es profesor de filosofía en la Universidad Libre de Berlín. Además de profesor de filosofía, Otto Wolff es también políticamente muy activo con el grupo de Los Verdes y ensayista. En la década de los 70 trabajó también en el Departamento de Ciencias Sociales de la Universidad de Coimbra bajo la dirección de Boaventura de Sousa Santos. Es miembro del Instituto de Análisis Social de la Fundación Rosa Luxemburgo, ha sido presidente de la Academia Humanista de Berlín y desde 2006 es presidente de la Academia Humanista Alemana. Es miembro también del Consejo Asesor Científico de ATAC y entre sus publicaciones destacan, aunque hay otras, Humanismo para el siglo XXI, Filosofía Radical y, junto a otros autores, Vivir en Europa, Filosofía, Política y Ciencia hoy. Bueno, creo que tenemos con esto solo algunas notas de todo lo que ellos dos han hecho a lo largo de sus décadas de docencia y no solo. Y bueno, os dejo con sus presentaciones. Al final tendremos un breve turno de palabras. Muchas gracias y gracias de nuevo por asistir. Okay.
So, well, thank you for coming. It's been a long day, I'm sure. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip the introduction to this paper and jump right in. We're getting a little bit late start. The first part was really about Marx and me and the impact that Karl Marx had on me and reading Das Kapital, and also the impact that a book I read much more recently had on me, Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. So jump right in now to part one, Marx, Keynes, and climate change. In the early years of what was coming to be known as eco-socialism, the 1970s and 80s, there was much criticism of the ecological flaws of Marxism. Marx, it was said, was a Promethean who believed it necessary for humans to dominate the natural world in order to end material want and create a new world of fulfillment and abundance. But in the late 1990s, a new strand of eco-socialism began to emerge, which paid particular attention to Marx's concept of metabolic rift, which derived from his close readings of the work of the German chemist Justus von Liebig. This was becoming increasingly clear as the selections from his 1968 ecological notebooks became available. A large literature on the subject was thus developed. It has become clear that Marx was concerned not only with the exploitation of workers, but also with, in his words, the robbery of nature. Needless to say, however, even though Marx was more concerned about ecological issues than has been previously recognized, he did not write about climate change. So the question I want to address is this: to what extent are elements of Marx's critique of capitalism relevant to our thinking about climate change? In particular, what might Marx say about the question often raised these days by eco-socialists, myself among them, is sustainable capitalism an oxymoron, a self-contradiction? To answer this question, let's consider a bit of economic theory as it's developed from Marx's time to our own. Marx and Engels famously noted in the Communist Manifesto that a new kind of economic crisis had emerged with the development of capitalism, a crisis that, quote, in all earlier epochs would have seemed an absurdity, an epidemic of overproduction. People going hungry because there's too much food. But the logic of the system that produces such a crisis is simple enough. Labor is a cost of production, which every capitalist strives to keep as low as possible. But if they succeed, then there may not be enough effective demand in the economy to purchase all that was produced, in which case workers are laid off, which lessens demand even more, which only intensifies the problem, leading to more layoffs, the familiar downward recessionary spiral. We get an absurd economic crisis. For the latter part of the 19th century, a new economic theory emerged. The classical theory of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Marx, based on the labor theory of value, was replaced by the neoclassical marginalist theory. Indeed, the classical theory had to be replaced, or as John Bates Clark, one of its proponents, proclaimed, the indictment that hangs over society is that of exploited labor. The welfare of the laboring class depends on whether they get much or little, but their attitude toward other classes, and therefore the stability of society, depends chiefly on the question of whether the amount they get, be it large or small, is what they produce. If they create a small amount of wealth and get the whole of it, they may not seek to revolutionize society. But if it were to appear that they produce an ample amount but get only a part of it, many of them would become revolutionists and all would have the right to. The neoclassical free market model demonstrates that under conditions of perfect competition, not only will everyone, workers, capitalists, and landowners, get what they contribute, but there will be no crises of overproduction, nor any involuntary unemployment. If there are too many goods produced, prices will drop until they can be purchased. If there are unemployed people wanting to work, competition will force wages down until it's profitable for all to be hired. Then came the Great Depression of 1929, which dragged on and on. John Maynard Keynes entered the scene with a radical new economic theory. The Keynesian critique of neoclassical economics is essentially this. Will prices always adjust appropriately when there's overproduction? No, says Keynes. Employers do not like to lower prices, particularly since they have other options, namely cutting back on production by laying off workers. But that only exacerbates the problem, as Marx and Engels had pointed out more than 80 years before. The problem, however, says Keynes, is not capitalism per se, but too much savings on the part of capitalists relative to investment. Investment involves buying equipment, buying raw materials, hiring new workers who will spend their wages on food, clothing, shelter, etc. But here's the problem, says Keynes. The invisible hand can't be counted on to provide enough obviously profitable investment opportunities to solicit the investment necessary to keep the economy growing rather than relapsing into recession. The Keynesian solution: when investor confidence wanes, the government must step in, lowering interest rates to make savings less attractive, investment more so. But that may not be enough. The invisible hand doesn't ensure full employment either. Unemployment may well cause wages to decline, but employers are not likely to hire more workers when wages drop. Indeed, declining wages mean workers buying less, hence lessening effective demand, the shortage of which caused the unemployment in the first place. In this case, says Keynes, the government must intervene more directly, buying more goods from the private sector, creating more jobs in the public sector. Well, where will the government get the money? Well, it can borrow it from that pile of excess savings causing the problem in the first place, or, if necessary, it can print some more. Not too much, for that will cause inflation, but enough to ensure full employment. Not too much. So, the problem of capitalism can be solved with wise government intervention. To be sure, Keynes did not think all the problems had been solved. Keynes notes in the final chapter of the General Theory that the, quote, outstanding faults of the economic society in which we live are not only its failure to provide for full employment, but also its arbitrary and inequitable distribution of wealth and income. But Keynes was optimistic. He doesn't think this unhealthy state will persist, for he thinks capital will soon become so plentiful that the return to capital will soon approach zero, which would mean, he says, quote, the euthanasia of the rentier, and consequently the euthanasia of the cumulative oppressive power of the capitalist to exploit the scarcity value of capital. Keynes's vision of the future goes beyond the euthanasia of the rentier. In a remarkable essay written just after the onset of the Great Depression, Keynes speculated about the economic possibilities for our grandchildren. He offered his opinion as to what our world would look like 100 years hence. 2030, not so far off anymore. 2030, not so far off. We shall use the newfound bounty of nature quite differently than the way the rich use it today, and will map out for ourselves a plan of life quite otherwise than theirs. What work there still remains to be done will be as widely shared as possible, 3-hour shifts or a 15-hour week. There will almost also be great changes in our morals. I see us free to return to some of the most sure and certain principles of religion and traditional virtue, that avarice is a vice, that the extraction of usury is a misdemeanor, that the love of money is detestable, that those walk most truly in the paths of virtue and sane wisdom, who take the least thought of the morrow. We shall honor those who can teach us how to pluck the hour in the day virtuously and well, the delightful people who are capable of taking direct enjoyment in things. Okay, what would Marx say about the Keynesian solution, the contradictions of capitalism? Marx, in fact, would not be at all surprised by Keynes's argument that capitalism without state intervention is crisis-prone, and that the crises are likely to get ever more severe. This was his own position. Nor would he be surprised to see the state being called upon to intervene in times of crisis to save the system. It's a basic tenet of historical materialism that the class that controls the economy also controls the state. Of course, he didn't think that the state intervention would ultimately prove successful. As he and Engels wrote in the Communist Manifesto, the modern bourgeois society is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld whom he has conjured up by his spells. He would, however, Marx would strongly disagree with Keynes's optimistic predictions that given the inevitable surplus of capital, the invisible hand would cause interest rates to drop to zero resulting in the euthanasia of the rentiers. History, of course, has proved Marx right here, Keynes wrong. The rentier capitalists making billions each year of interest, dividends, and capital gains have seen their wealth surge to unprecedented heights in recent decades, as Thomas Piketty famously and graphically has shown. Nor would he agree that the inevitable workings of the system would lead to the 3-hour-a-day, 15-hour work week that Keynes's grandchildren were to expect. Marx's objection here is most salient to the issue of climate change. Keynes's future would be an ecologist's dream, a steady state economy where material consumption stabilizes and human beings have the leisure essential to genuine human flourishing. It is also virtually identical to Marx's higher stage of communism. But could this come about via the smooth and natural workings of capitalism? In the first part of Capital, Marx assumed what later economists would call perfect competition, a system in which supply and demand are in equilibrium, where there's no force or fraud, where every item, including labor power, is purchased at true market value. Even under such perfect conditions, Marx argues, exploitation occurs. It is essentially invisible. But exploitation occurs for one very simple reason. The free market, in accordance with the laws of supply and demand, determine the price of all commodities in this ideal, perfect, competitive society, including the cost of labor. But there's one thing the market does not determine. It does not determine the length of the working day. This crucial economic variable is not determined by the invisible hand, but by class struggle. Where right conflicts with right, Marx writes, force decides. I still remember my astonishment in reading this section, something of immense importance that I'd never thought about. What determines the length of the working day? Marx then devotes an entire chapter to the historical struggles that have taken place over precisely this issue. The key point, productivity increases do not translate automatically into more leisure. Clearly, it is Marx, not Keynes, who's been proven right on this point also. It's worth recalling that in the United States, major demonstrations calling for an 8-hour day began in 1886. That goal was not achieved until a half-century later, during the Great Depression, and has not come down since. Indeed, a 2008 Harvard Business School survey of thousands of professionals found that 94% worked 50 hours or more per week, not the 15 that Keynes was predicting, and almost half worked more than 65 hours a week. Part 2, a terrifying moment, a miraculous part 2. Climate change represents an existential threat to humanity. We all know our species is imperiled and the clock is ticking. 2014 was the hottest year ever recorded until 2015 surpassed it, which was then surpassed by 2016 and then in turn by 2017. The data isn't in yet on 2018, but the New York Times headline last July proclaimed how record heat wreaked havoc on 4 continents. We can be pretty sure what the data will yield. A tidal wave of bad news, and yet there's still something miraculous about the unprecedented historical moment in which we are living. Consider 4 astonishing facts. First of all, we know we have a global problem. Had the chemistry of our planet's atmosphere been slightly different, global warming could have occurred during the first century of the Industrial Revolution, given the massive increase in the amount of coal we were suddenly burning. We would have had no way of measuring the temperature of the globe. Weather patterns would have started changing, but they would have been perceived as local perturbations or simply random acts of God. Secondly, we know what is causing the problem. A century ago, we couldn't have known, but at precisely the time when our science is developed to the point we are able to determine that global temperature is rising, it is also developed to the point where we can say with near certainty why it is rising. the massive amount of invisible carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases that we have been pouring into the atmosphere. Third, we have the technological means to solve the problem. It's amazing, is it not, that at precisely the moment when the evidence becomes overwhelming that the major cause of global warming is our dependence on fossil fuels, renewable energy technologies, solar, wind, and water have become sophisticated enough to virtually eliminate our need for fossil fuels. Indeed, plans have been drawn up demonstrating that this shift to renewable energy can be feasibly accomplished in a relatively short time. We are not in a situation comparable to the one depicted in the Lars von Trier film Melancholia. A rogue planet is discovered to be on collision course with the Earth, and nothing can be done to stop it. Fourth, we have the resources not only to avoid catastrophe, but in the process to make life better, healthier, happier, a life of human flourishing for almost everyone on the planet. There's still enough arable land available on the planet to feed all of us, at least if we shift to healthier, less meat-intensive diets. Our renewable energy technologies can supply our energy needs. Of course, rich countries will have to cut back on the mindless consumption and substitute more leisure for more consumption. But numerous happiness studies verify what traditional religious teachings have always maintained. Beyond a certain point, increased consumption does not increase overall happiness. Gandhi is right. The earth provides enough for every man's needs, but not for every man's good. This is truly an unprecedented moment. Another world is possible, a better world is possible, and we know what needs to be done to achieve this other better world. Part 3, what is standing in the way? Now, my thinking on this question has evolved recently, even as I worked on this paper. I've long argued that what's standing in the way is the capitalist class. I'm sure Marx would agree. I'm not going to retract that claim, but I now think it's more complicated than I first thought. It's no secret that very powerful capitalist interests, particularly those deriving from fossil fuel industries, have been driving the anthropogenic climate change denialist movement. Among the most notorious are the infamous Koch brothers. The Forbes 400 list came out recently, the 400 richest Americans in 2017. Charles and David Koch's combined wealth is now $97 billion. This is a $13 billion increase from 2016, despite their having spent $1 billion on the 2016 U.S. elections. That's $1 billion. That $1 billion is $1,000 million. That's $1 million to donate to each of 1,000 candidates in 2016, and still have 13,000 million left over for such nonprofit organizations, to spend on other things, such as nonprofit organizations like the notorious Chicago-based Heartland Institute and dozens of others. It's really hard to imagine such wealth, but that's the world we now live in. Let's see, I think I've got a quick summary of that. Charles David Koch, 97 billion wealth, 2016, 14 billion increase. Money spent to the 2016 elections, okay, $1 million to each of 1,000 candidates. Money left to spend on other things, $13,000 million. Okay, the effects of the massive campaign spending are obvious enough. Currently, only 8 of the 236 members of the U.S. House of Representatives are willing to admit that climate change is largely human caused. 8 out of 236. But the institutional investment should not be taken lightly. Their effects may be even worse. Here's a sampling from the Heartland Institute webpage. Overwhelming scientific evidence suggests that greenhouse gas-induced global climate signal is so small as to be embedded within the background variability of the natural climate system. And it is not dangerous. At the same time, global temperature change is occurring, as it naturally always does. The evidence is overwhelming that rising atmospheric carbon dioxide levels will continue to help plants thrive, leading to greater biodiversity, shrinking deserts, expanded habitat for wildlife, and more food for a growing human population. Okay, that's insane to be sure, but they back up their claims with data from seemingly reputable sources, lots of citations, and they have influence. Their webpage proudly proclaims approximately 120 academic and professional economists participate in its peer review process, and nearly 200 elected officials serve on its legislative forum. According to a survey of randomly selected state and local officials conducted in 2009, 85% of state legislators and 63% of local officials say they read and rely on Heartland publications. Heartland's full-time staff of government relations professionals interact daily with hundreds of elected officials across the country, and its public relations and media specialists help shape public opinion by writing and placing dozens of letters to the editor and opinion editorials every week. Now, of course, it's no mystery why the fossil fuel billionaires are so concerned. As scientific reports make clear, if we're going to have even a 50% chance of staying within the 1.5 centigrade temperature increase, most of the fossil fuel must stay in the ground. But those reserves represent $27 trillion, more than a third larger than the entire gross national product of the United States. Those reserves would be stranded. Human nature, or at least that of Homo economicus, surely kicks in here. Climate change can't be real if it would cause our fortunes to evaporate. We better make sure people don't take these fearmongers seriously. Get out your checkbooks. But here is the mystery. Why are the fossil fuel guys so successful? To be sure, they have almost unimaginable sums of money at their disposal. But I looked again at the Forbes 400 list and noted the wealth sources of the top 50 in the United States. Only 3 of the top 50 are linked to fossil fuels, as compared to 15 linked to finance, 14 linked to tech sectors, the rest being other. Don't these other mega billionaires have children? Aren't they surrounded by smart people who can distinguish between arguments based on credible data and the self-serving other kind? Why are these guys not pouring resources into organizations calling for a massive effort of the scale and scope of a World War II mobilization extended globally to head off species catastrophe? Another book of huge significance, published in 2016, provides, I think, the answer. It's a book everyone here should read, if you haven't already. It has been, for reasons that will become obvious, ferociously attacked by many reviewers. The book was written by Nancy McLean, a noted historian at Duke University. Its title, Democracy in Chains. Its subtitle, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America. Now, you notice in this whole section I'm concentrating on the United States because we are, per capita, by far the largest emitter of greenhouse gases and so on, and in complete denial about it politically. How does this happen? Before saying a bit about this book, let me offer some background. In the late 1960s, early 70s, the capitalist class in the United States began to get nervous. This was at a time of widespread student activism, a time in which the country with the most formidable military machine ever assembled was losing its war against a poor Southeast Asian country, a time when communist guerrilla movements had become active in almost every country in what was known as the Third World, a time when people in the West, particularly young people, were reading Marx again and insisting that their universities hire at least a few faculty, such as myself, to teach such material. In 1971, prior to being appointed by Richard Nixon to the United States Supreme Court, Lewis Powell was commissioned by the United States Chamber of Commerce, a long-standing private organization dedicated to protecting the interest of business, to write a confidential memorandum entitled Attack on the American Free Enterprise System, which called upon wealthy business interests to retake America. Powell argued, quote, the most disquieting voices are joining the chorus of criticism coming from perfectly respectable elements of society, from the college campus, the pulpit, the media, the intellectual and literary journals, the arts and sciences, and from politicians. In the memorandum, Powell advocated constant surveillance of textbook and television content, as well as a purge of left-wing elements. Then, following the seemingly successful Reagan-Thatcher counterattack, capitalist anxiety subsided. The communist regimes of Eastern Europe collapsed, then the Soviet Union itself. We had reached, as political scientist Francis Fukuyama famously proclaimed, the end of history. Democratic capitalism reigned supreme and would continue to do so forever. But of course, history didn't end. With the threat of communism gone, the capitalist class lost its coherence. As rabbi philosopher Michael Lerner pointed out, the rational capitalist class, formerly constrained to improving the lot of their own working class to keep them from becoming infected with the communist virus, gave way to crackpot billionaires pursuing their own uncoordinated individual interests. The once rational capitalist class became irrational. Or at least it seemed so to Lerner and to me. I now think we were wrong. We've been wrong in thinking that the capitalist class had become disorganized, pulled in contradictory directions, each member pursuing his own narrow self-interest. Now, a lot of capitalists were that way, but there's another crucial element here. Nancy MacLean changed my mind. Her book recounts, in the author's words, quote, the utterly chilling story of the ideological origins of the single most powerful and least understood threat to democracy today, the attempt by the billionaire-backed radical right to undo democratic governance. This carefully researched book tells the previously unknown story of the alliance of Nobel laureate economist James Buchanan with the brilliant billionaire, young at the time, Charles Koch. A network is formed that adopts what they themselves refer to as a Leninist strategy. Create a cadre of full-time revolutionaries. Stay beneath the radar. Divide your enemies, etc. It's a strategy that goes well beyond the standard crude and obvious strategies of the political right, fanning the flames of resentment of the lower classes against the liberal elite and shifting the blame for their distress onto racial and ethnic minorities, immigrants, etc. Although, of course, they do that too when deemed appropriate. A short list of some of their key components. Oops. Koch network. Okay. Create a cadre of full-time revolutionaries by creating and massively funding issue-oriented nonprofit organizations. And there are now hundreds out there. 2. Create a counterintelligentsia to make libertarianism intellectually respectable in academic circles. Set up programs at various universities. Create endowed chairs, etc. 3. Form strategic alliances to make libertarianism into, I'm sorry, that was the counterintelligence. Form strategic alliances, particularly with the Christian fundamentalists. I mean, these people aren't fundamental Christians at all, but form these alliances. 4. Cut back on public funding of colleges and universities to make them ever more dependent on wealthy donors. 5. Cut back the liberal arts in colleges, harboring tenured radicals who are brainwashing their students and turning them into socialists. And finally, intervene heavily in state and local elections, never losing sight of Buchanan's principle. Long-term meaningful change requires not so much changing the rulers, but changing the rules, i.e. taking control of the judiciary and pushing for constitutional change at the state and national level to keep democracy ever more tightly in chains. Conclusion. One cannot understate the magnitude and power of the Koch network. As Jane Mayer has documented, the network has supported at least 64 right-wing, nonprofit, issue-oriented organizations, and it's more than that now, has made substantial donations to many, many colleges and universities. To return to my earlier question, why are these guys, the libertarian radical right, so successful in blocking action on climate change when they represent a relatively small segment of the capitalist class? I'm inclined now to say because this segment is vastly more organized and carefully focused than any capitalist segment that might take climate change seriously. Moreover, their carefully crafted and widely disseminated ideological output serves to reassure the great majority of the capitalist class who, like most people, generally do not want to think about so terrifying an issue, that they don't really need to worry. If there is indeed a problem, however unlikely, capitalist entrepreneurs will come up with a technological innovation that will solve the problem without unduly disrupting the system. But might not some of these capitalists change their minds? The ones who do take science seriously and who care about their children and grandchildren. It's worth recalling the words of Marx and Engels here. When it becomes evident that the bourgeoisie is unfit anymore to be the ruling class and to impose its conditions of existence on society as an overriding law, in times when the class struggle nears the decisive hour, a small section of the ruling class cuts itself adrift and joins the revolutionary class, the class that holds the future in its hands. To be sure, as Naomi Klein points out, no messiahs, the green billionaires won't save us, but some of them might be able to help. The climate change movement is certainly going to grow as deniability becomes increasingly impossible. So will the fascist reaction, already growing at a rate unimaginable a decade ago. Since the well-funded, well-organized radical right, working hard to tighten the chains to keep democracy from being unduly democratic, will not hesitate to utilize such organizations and tactics if they seem to be losing control. Democracy versus fascism. If victorious, leading over time, I would argue, to a form of democratic socialism, with the latter, if victorious, leading to species extinction. This, I think, is the struggle of our time. I think Marx would agree. Remember, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx argued that the first step in the seizure of power by the proletariat is to win the battle of democracy. Postscript that occurred after I'd already written this paper. 3 weeks ago, Paul Krugman, a Nobel laureate economist, who also writes a regular column for the New York Times, wrote a column entitled, "Why It Can Happen Here." And he was talking about fascism in the United States. And then just last week, The Atlantic magazine, which is not a left publication, devoted its entire issue to "Is Democracy Dying? The Slow Motion Crisis in America and the World." So with that, is that enough? There we go. And shrink it down. Oh, and it's
okay.
Switch over here.
Yeah. muchas gracias por el convite. Voy a hacer mi intervención en dos partes. Primero voy a hablar en castellano, quiere decir el castellano de los portugueses, y después en inglés. Simplemente quería añadir una cosa para mi presentación, es la referencia al primer manifiesto ecosocialista que fue publicado en el final de los años 80 y con autoría de Pierre Juquin y otros, entre ellos yo, que fue publicado aquí en España en varias lenguas del Estado español. Quería, como resultado de los debates de esa tarde, hacer 4 comentarios breves. Primero, sobre la problemática del materialismo. Me lembro que Luis Althusser, un amigo mío, decía que materialismo es no se hace ilusiones, o en otro sitio, que los filósofos materialistas toman y dejan los trenes en curso. No hay un comienzo absoluto para ellos, son ocasiones de intervención. Y en ese sentido pienso que es importante de superar el problema del determinismo, el problema del reduccionismo y el problema del substancialismo, que están ligados a las varias variantes del materialismo, también en los debates marxistas. Quizás Mario Bunge, un filósofo argentino, con su idea de un materialismo emergentista, nos da una pista para seguir. Segundo, en cuanto a naturaleza, tenemos muchos problemas con falsas oposiciones. La oposición entre naturaleza e historia, la oposición entre procesos naturales y actividades humanas, la oposición entre naturaleza y cultura, o entre naturaleza y técnica, son todas falsas oposiciones. Se tiene de pensar la historia, la actividad humana, la cultura, la técnica, dentro de un horizonte de una naturaleza de la cual los seres humanos y su historia es parte. Se ve en la historia ecológica de las sociedades humanas que continúan hacia ese día, solamente con la grande diferencia que en los tiempos antiguos hubo crisis ecológicas, por ejemplo, la extinción de los mamuts, ya en la edad de piedra, o la transformación de la ecología del continente de Australia por los fuegos de los indígenas. Más esos eran crisis, extinciones, destrucciones de ecosistemas específicos. Hoy tenemos el problema de destrucción totalizante. Por ejemplo, la micropolución, que está recién descubrida. Es una cosa que es en los cuerpos humanos, en los océanos, en el ar, en el Himalaya, en las montañas aisladas, es casi en toda parte. Y así tenemos una claramente mayor urgencia del problema ecológico. Porque, como puedo seguir totalmente al colega, la cuestión se pone de sobrevivencia del género humano. Si continuamos como hemos andado en los últimos siglos, es de certeza que el género humano va a ser de historia del planeta. Y tercero, en cuanto a ecología, pienso que es muy importante de comprender que la teoría moderna de los ecosistemas no es una simple extensión del pensamiento de Libre y de Marx sobre la dependencia material y energética del impacto energético y material de las actividades humanas. Los ecosistemas son sistemas dinámicos y complejos que tienen su propia lógica y un cierto grado de indeterminación que resulta. Y felizmente estamos en ese planeta con algo que es una gift, un dado de la naturaleza al género humano, que es una posibilidad de usufruir del planeta, mas tiene limitaciones que una revolución socialista no va a cambiar. Antes, por lo contrario, una revolución ecosocialista tiene de realmente respetar por la primera vez esos límites. Y eso es algo que en la tradición marxista nunca fue considerada. En Marx y en Engels sí, pero en los partidos socialdemócratas o comunistas o anarquizantes que se reclamaban de las teorías de Marx y Engels, yo encontré en discusiones aquí en España representantes de comunismo elaborado que decían, después de la revolución, el desarrollo de las fuerzas productivas será infinito, inmenso. No hay límites. Es una ilusión que hace parte de nuestra herencia, mas que tenemos de superar. Y al final, porque eso era un problema en los debates que oí, el problema de la transición. Pero ante la imposibilidad actual de la revolución en el occidente de que discutía Gramsci, tenemos de ver y estudiar las posibilidades, cómo alargar el espacio político democrático realmente accesible para poder poner en términos reales los problemas de una transición socialista. Y eso es una tarea política específica y muy difícil. Es una transición antes de la transición. Pero no hay alternativa a reconquistar esa posibilidad de transición. Una transición socialista respetuosa de las tareas ecológicas y antiimperialistas y feministas que están no solamente una subdivisión del análisis marxista, mas tienen su propia lógica, su propia posibilidad de desarrollarse, su propia lógica científica, que tenemos de respetar. Ahora voy a intentar continuar con mi presentación en inglés. No soy inglés ni americano, soy alemán, pero voy a intentar. First, I think I have to address the problem of the state of the debate, but I can't read it like this. I have to leave. Well, we have the older debate, we had the older debate on eco-socialism. And there we were all bent upon telling the world that, telling the world that the problem is not only to overcome capitalism, it's also the problem of overcoming what has been called industrialism, what has been called the way capitalism is exploiting and destroying nature, which is a specific dimension of capitalism. Then we had the ecofeminist interventions, which made it clear that androcentric structures of domination, not to speak of patriarchal powers, were very much a real part of the present situation in our societies. And to some degree, Frantz Fanon and others have raised the problems of dependencia, the problems of dependency, which are not entirely, at least, reducible to the problems of capitalist imperialism. So there too, we had to discover, and were told by others as Marxists, that we have to rethink deeply. This, I think, fortunately, coincided with the challenge of rereading Marx, because it's now 5 or 6 years ago, we dispose of all the manuscripts of Capital. We do not yet dispose of all manuscripts of Marx, especially not of his later critique of politics and his later critique of modern ecology. But we have now the possibility to look at where exactly Marx came in his elaboration, where he was still trying to find a way, where he was still on the state of making first sketches. And this has already started very interesting work in various approaches, trying to rethink where Marx left, not just trying to reconstruct what Marx has said, which is already an important task, but also to take up the ongoing work which Marx, who has been working on questions of ecology, has been less working on questions of feminism, but the socialist movement did, and take this work up where Marx left it, because now we are able to read him in his, well, in completeness, in his contradictions, in his achievements, because even if I said that his ecology is still very much, well, in the limits of the Libre approach, which is important, so I differ with Burkett and others who try to think that this is already everything. It is not. It is an important part, but looking at ecosystems and their variability and their pliability and their reproducibility is something different from just making an economico-energetical balance. Here, I think, in the meantime, we can rely on Kohei Saito's reading of Marx's ecology. I was happy to be one of the supervisors at the faculty in Berlin. But I think we have go beyond just rereading Marx. We have to construct a theory of the ecological dimension of the reproduction of human economies and societies, which goes beyond just this reconstruction. That is, we have also to do something about, this is addressed to you, the systematic location of market socialism or economic democracy in the processes we have to address. I do not think that they are insignificant, but I think that the problem of finding a plan, developing a plan, developing the transformations by centralized and coordinated intervention is something which is not solved by market socialism or by economic democracy alone. Now I think I have. Well, we have indeed effective systematic theoretical problems to address. We have the unfinished system of Marx. We have the missing explicit development of the societal reproduction of social labor, of labor power, sorry. In the second volume of Capital, Marx makes a short remark. This is very easy, I therefore leave it aside, because it's not easy. Because the reproduction of labor power is gendered, is ecological, and it is located and historical. So, well, the classical example is the English tea pause, which the English workers imposed on their capitalists. But this is, of course, not something that is general, but is cultural. And I suppose Spanish workers, with less powers than the English, I know, have imposed similar things to their capitalists. Then we have the need for developing the theory of credit and the theory of state intervention within the theory of the capitalist mode of production, left out by Marx, promised a later book on the state, but never wrote it, and probably could not write it. And the credit things, there we have sketches, which have just been reworked and elaborated by a student of mine. And I think this will make it possible to read Capital, the book, backwards from the most developed forms of capitalist reproduction via the credit and banking system, financial capitalism, which, for instance, includes the savings of the workers into the reproduction of capital by the savings banks. And this is not something you can decipher on the basis of the 3 volumes of Capital as Marx left us. There we have to invest another effort. And I think it is important to understand these dynamics of capitalism in order to be able to overcome the ecological destruction which this entire system is working. Then we have the need also in rereading Marx for an interface, for establishing an interface, theoretically establishing it, with gender relations, ecological conditions and effects, and relations of dependency. And beyond that, we have real problems of actualization, of really going beyond Marx's system. Not in the sense of the stages theory of capitalism, which was blocking the debate. So Marx is about competition capitalism. Now we have imperialism, something like that. Look at Marx's critique of political economy as an incomplete but expandable system. So Marx himself made the important remarks that the society by actions, Aktiengesellschaft, is the modern firm, which is not a firm of persons, but of capital owned and brought together, that this should be developed inside of his theory of the capitalist mode of production, but he didn't do it. So in this vein, I think the first things I have mentioned could and should be done, but there are things which go beyond that. First, we have to go beyond the issues of energy transformation in the Libre style in order to grasping ecosystemic effects, which are, well, not gradualistic, not adding up. They are catastrophic. They are jumping in various directions. So this is why, for instance, looking at the climate problems, it is so difficult to have a prognosis, But still we can say with 1.5, we have a reasonable chance. With 2, it's rather bad, but still survival is possible. But this really has to be looked at theoretically. So we have to go beyond these important achievements, like concerning the ozone layer, concerning climate change, where we have reliable scientific knowledge produced and pooled and made accessible for political implementation. We have to do this for other major issues, beginning with the decline of the number of species, which is galloping. So there we have to find counter strategies. And I think we have to find counter strategies which can begin to be implemented before a socialist transition, because time is running. Then we have find new ways of overcoming the political form of the state as a form of plural domination, which is not just the class state, it's also the state of male dominance, it's the state more or less of white dominance, it's the state of northern dominance, so it's also a state with a role in international relations. And I think there we have a lot of theoretical work to do. And we have to rethink what Lenin has called the half state of liberatory transition, also known under the very difficult and misleading term dictatorship of the proletariat. So this half state, what is it? What can it be? Where can it begin to be built? And can it begin to be built before taking power? Is taking power a one-point thing? Is it happening at one place, or is it a process? Where can it start? How can we start it? How can we break away from the domination of the various powers which are dominant in our complex and overdetermined societies? And we have to think and rethink the real material limitations, even of liberated societies, as real ecological constraints. So even in liberated society, we shall not be able as humans to do whatever we like. We shall have to find ways of living within the confines, which are flexible, yes, but they are there, of human ecology. I have more. Oh, sorry. Now, I think I have to look at the time because maybe I should go to this. Modern transformations to overcome the existing complex of dynamic modern structures of domination. We have to attack and to dissolve in a controlled way the established capitalist, androcentric, and imperial structures of domination, starting a political process of continuously and effectively mobilizing against them. We have to start or continue, because some planning exists within the great companies, within some states, not in the United States, but for instance in France or in the European Union. The European Commission is doing a lot of planning. 20, 50, 30 years ahead, they have plans. And they have ways to measure how far the plans have been and can be implemented and what can be done to improve the implementation. We have to start and continue a broadly based democratic control of the options and objectives underlying these planning processes, something where we are almost at zero. We have to enhance and develop self-activity and self-transformation, because it's not just the liberal ego, the possessive individual, which is going to start the process. It will be an individual transformed, and transforming itself from the kind of patriarchal, white, male, whatever, dominating subject participating in domination that we are all. It's not that somebody or some people are outside. Even the female proletarians in the center or in the periphery are in some way parts and participating in these systems of domination. It's not from outside, but from inside, by developing the contradictions, by developing the resistances that this has to be overcome. We have to implement and finally respect liberty of debate and methodical control of the truth of statements as the double condition for a self-correcting learning planning process. We have the place to rethink the place of workers' control, feminine awareness, and subaltern thinking in a process of liberation. And we have to find, indeed, places for market mechanisms, but specific defined places for market mechanisms within modern complex planning processes. Well, we have, just to remind you, I already have alluded to this, modern crisis of human ecology, the ozone layer punctuation more or less resolved, which is a positive example. We have the climate crisis. Well, we may fail to solve it, but we may also find a good or a bad solution. We have the problem of the biodiversity reduction, which is a major problem, which has to be addressed urgently and on a planetary scale, and which is not yet addressed. And we have this mentioned, which I mentioned already, endemic contamination by microparticles. And this is not a complete list, but this is just what I had in mind. The complex task to be addressed, therefore, is to look at the overdetermination of crisis on the level of the concrete constellations of modern societies on the planet Earth. The cyclical and structural economic crisis, the crisis of the reproduction structures of domination within gender relations, relations of dependency, the political crisis of the state form. I just mentioned the example of failed states, and the policy crisis. And we have to oppose to these crises initiatives of concrete, specific liberation. That is not the liberation of the possessive ego, but the liberation of living individuals, overcoming the unbroken domination of the capitalist mode of production in modern societies, as well as specific overdetermination by forms of gender domination, specific overdetermination by forms of international, intra and intranational dependency, while at the same time respecting the limitations imposed by the global ecology of the planet Earth, possibilitating a full reproduction of the existing dynamic constellations of ecosystems, as it is possible on the basis of the great gift of nature to humankind, which is the usufruct of the earth. I think I simply stop here because I have already abused your patience quite a lot. Thank you.
Tenemos todavía unos minutos, por si queréis hacerles preguntas a cualquiera de ellos. Solo levantad la mano y pueden ser directamente en inglés, nos ahorramos tiempo, pero alguien, quizá entre vosotros, maybe you something to say to one another? Or no?
Yeah, I had one point. I have to look at my notes, which are over here. So, notes. Yeah. The simple problem of translation. What was it? You were talking about force, quoting the Communist Manifesto. But I think it's Gewalt in German. And Gewalt also translates as violence and as power. And I think power and violence are more what Marx is talking about. It's not just simple physical or force it's power relations we are talking about.
Well, that was that's in Capital. That's about the length of the working day. And,
but I think it's...
His point there, I mean, I just took it as the worker says, I've got a right to, live my life and get enough and so on. And the capital says, you're working for me. I got a right to get as much out of you as possible.
Well, I think it's reinforcing your argument.
Yeah.
To put power.
Or power is probably right.
Yeah. Force is just sort of technologically demobilizing.
And I would also say, just in response to the market socialism argument, that actually the model that I talk about makes room precisely for long-term planning, because in the model of economic democracy that I lay out, investment is public. Okay, the investment fund is generated, and therefore it makes possible long-range planning. That's part of the critique of capitalism. James Galbraith famously said, markets are great except there's two problems. The poor don't count, and the future doesn't count. I mean, we've got to plan long-term. We've got to have public control over planning. I'm completely agreement with you on that.
Well, maybe I should make one remark concerning the debate we just had this afternoon. I think there is a strong tendency among Marxists and socialists to think in terms of the world we want to have, to think in terms of making a jump there. Mm-hmm. But the issue is how to define the next steps. And the next steps will not be, I think this is certain in our countries, steps of socialist transition of any kind.
Yeah, that's actually
steps towards enlarging the possibilities of democratic decision making. But even then, it will be very, very limited.
I mean, that's one of the things I was getting at in the last part of my paper, that making democracy, which I do think democracy becomes the issue, because it's clear that the capitalist class in particular, but particularly the fossil fuel people, but the capitalists generally feel threatened. They realize how small they are, how rich they are, and how discontent everybody is out there. And you see in the United States, in particular, the Republican Party. And this is what was shocking and striking to me, that kind of a liberal commentator like Paul Krugman was saying, we're just on a nice edge of drifting into fascism, because we've got a party in the United States, the Republican Party, that has basically been taken over. And one of the things they're doing is restricting democracy, voter suppression, all over the place. They don't want people voting, particularly African-American people, Latino people, and so on, because they will tend to vote the other way. But just generally, and in fact, you're even seeing major philosophers. Jason Brennan just wrote a book published by Princeton University Press against democracy, that we've got to worry about democracy. And that's picked up on now. The Trump phenomenon is very interesting in the sense that it cuts both ways, because people that are upset about Trump can say, yeah, that's what democracy gives you. All these people out there that are stupid and they're just voting for the wrong reasons. We need an educated elite and so on and so forth. So this issue of democracy is really, really crucial. And I think that, and I think that's where you can see, yeah, you don't have to go say we've got to make it all the way to socialism, although we certainly need I think if we had a genuine democracy, that is where we would go. Ultimately, but I think the steps right now are to preserve democracy and extend democracy against a very real threat that's developing. It's developing in Europe. It's developing, in the United States in ways that were just unimaginable just a decade or two ago. So I think this is a really fundamental game. And the fact that places like the Atlantic magazine are worrying about that. No one ever talked about problems of democracy in the United States. We've always been a democracy. Fascism is something that happened in Europe, couldn't possibly happen in the United States. And now you're seeing the rise of paramilitary white nationalist organizations, and they're, spreading, these small groups, the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys and so on and so forth, saying we're taking military training so that if we need to be called upon, we'll be there to fight against the left that's out there to take over the country. I mean, it's really, I've never seen anything like this in my lifetime. And I think climate change is also the clock that's ticking here. There has to be action done, and there is action. There's action in the other direction. There is the environmental movement. There is this immensely important rise of women, and women politically, women activists, and so on and so forth, which fit together in the sense of an ethic of care, of caring for the planet, and getting involved, this is really unprecedented historical moment that we're living in. I tell my students, subsequent generations, historians, if there are any, are going to write about this as a fundamental turning point in human history that we're living in right now. We're going to make it or we're not going to make it. And it could be a lot better than it is now. It could be a lot worse. So that's where we are right now, I think.
Well, I would like to add something in a European perspective, which is very simple. We don't have a European state. We have the European Union, but how it works can be illustrated by the case of Greece. There we had a left-wing majority which was trying to address the major problems which immediately had to be solved in the interests of the population. And we had a major intervention by the European Union, the International Monetary Fund, and they have forced the Greek government to the extremes of adapting to a process of capitalist or neoliberal restructuring, which everybody knew would not get Greece out of crisis, but would help to avoid the bankruptcy of the German and French banks who had heavily invested in Greece. This has been achieved. Greece is impoverished. Hopefully, they will be able to get their thing together and continue, because there's a lot of left-wing disillusion, which is unjustified. Because if you are in a situation of weakness, you have to accept compromises which are more or less dictates of the other side. The other possibility would be to give over to the right, to execute the same dictates in their manner. And that's still a political difference to be observed. And lots of, I don't know about the situation in Spain, but in Germany, there was practically no solidarity with the Syriza government trying to manage these evil compromises. I'm not saying anything to justify the compromises, only that they had to be made somehow, because There was no alternative. Getting Greece out of the European Union, catastrophe, immediate catastrophe. And what else? So within the European Union, these dictates had to be accepted to some degree and to be sabotaged as well as it was possible. And this is very limited, these possibilities. But I think this is something the left will have to understand. And this, I say this because this will be in the immediate future. The left will be weak in many places and will have to opt for the minimum that can be had because time is running.
Muchas gracias, thank you both. Gracias a los asistentes de aquí por hoy. Muchas gracias también a los traductores que han estado acompañándonos esta tarde. Muchas gracias. Gracias.
You probably don't know about the other bus is taking us back. They're already gone.
I think it's at 9.
Oh, is it at 9?
I think so, but